I'm finding it difficult to put a bow on the core of what I've sort of expressed here, other than to just reference again notion of causality, or perhaps thinking influence beyond causation, which might not be the best sentence in the world, but it certainly gives a bit of a flavor of some of the inquiry.
Now, the perfect is the enemy of the good. We're always better off taking a dropper's worth of the witch's cauldron and seeing what we can cultivate out of that. And you can pick that from anywhere. It's bound to unfold in its own way anyway.
Totally. Well, that's interesting though, isn't it? Because when synchronicity occurs, in my experience, it almost always feels utterly perfect. Like, in a sense, it's like profound alignment. So that would be another question. What does alignment mean to you?
What does alignment mean to me? Okay, so how would I answer this question? I mean, it means a few things, at least in the work that that I'm doing or what I'm thinking about these days. It's hard to get away from the initial sense that, I would have used the word alignment, which is in the role-playing game sense, which is, whatever, a quick and dirty system of personality testing or something. You can see that redone infinitely online. So that's become a very generalized bit of D&D knowledge. The second sense, of course, is the AI sense of alignment, which is to say, trying to get its, whatever ethical and moral restraint system properly aligned with ours so that we don't, have bad outcomes, right? We want it to sort of value what we value and steer us in beneficial ways if it's going to steer us. So there's that sense of alignment. And then maybe there's the more metaphysical sense in which you're talking about. When I think about that and, mentioning the concept of synchronicity, as we've discussed previously, I'm always trying to undertake an active effort to remain both sort of open-minded, but also highly provisional, right? This is sort of the militant agnosticism. So I want to onboard a premise, but not overcommit to a premise, right? Without adequate, backup. And frankly, everything is kind of massively underdetermined and we exist in a high uncertainty state. So, looking at it a few ways, I don't know that it's determinable, for instance, when we're talking about synchronicity, in the same way as it's not determinable the existence or non-existence of God, right? Famously, when Jung talks about it, right? Is the whole point is that is a kind of a knowable epistemological thing, right? That we have those experiences, but that the reality behind it is not accessible to us, right? So no bit of evidence can confirm or disconfirm the existence of God, but we still have to deal with those forces in our psyche, right? They are there, they are operating, we're missing something if we miss them. I think synchronicity is closely tied to this. The funny thing about synchronicity is, yes, when one experiences one, generally speaking, it comes with this incredible degree of piercing specificity, right? And yes, I think that, it behooves one to run through the standard list of like rational filters, confirmation bias and the number of things I'm missing and blah, 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 blah. But I think a lot of the time, if you're sort of really honest about it, these experiences occur when you sort of run the back of the envelope calculations on their improbability, you are left scratching your head. Like, it has a degree of specificity. It has that bon mot quality, right? Which a dream symbol can have also, right? That kind of, it seems to more perfectly encapsulate than what we are capable of doing consciously, something about it. So synchronicity often has that quality. The thing that interests me from the perspective of alignment in that sense, even though we don't know, we can't determine or prove, right? Proofs are for math, whether or not a synchronicity is like real in the sense that, right? Is it real? Is it really organizing things metaphysically? It sure seems like it is. And the effects that it has on us are typically quite profound, right? So what's interesting there is that very often, I think synchronicity, when one experiences it, at least in terms of psychological wellness, is less about necessarily trying to decode it and play junior detective, try to figure out every little symbol and chase it down and figure out exactly what it's telling you to do, than it is speaking to a general state of alignment or pulling you into a state of alignment where the parts of yourself are in alignment, almost like you're sort of magnetized, right? The parts of yourself suddenly line up. Your connection to the world is suddenly lined up in a way that seems to massively implicate you in your experience and interrelate mind and the world in a way that is not, I think, what most of us are typically sort of operating, right? We're not operating that way. So I typically take it as a signpost of alignment, right? When I'm dealing with clients and they have that, I'm like, well, don't go too far down the interpretive rabbit hole, right? Unless it's, screaming at you with something that's very obvious. And even then, you should check twice before you make a sacrifice. But in general, it seems to me that it's a sort of sign of psychological alignment, that when things are lined up, we have these experiences. And when things are sometimes charged and highly disaligned, we have these experiences and they have the effect of aligning us.
Yeah, well said. The other day I was putting together a concept document for a festival. And one of the things I said was that this festival would encourage serendipitous experiences and encounters. Now, I use that word because using the word synchronicity among the potential partners and maybe contexts I'm wanting to draw together is a little less common. And this is an early phase, but really I'm saying, yes, I'm interested in designing for synchronicity, to welcome that. So how would you think about that? What would it mean? What would it entail to design for synchronicity? Is there even something coherent we can say about that?
I think so. When I consider the concept of designing for synchronicity, the thing that comes most readily to mind is magic, right? Ceremonial magic, specifically speaking, right? To a practitioner of magic, if they're taking this stuff seriously, generally speaking, their practice is designed through, whatever combination of sort of psychotechnologies and ecologies of practice and, right, the various techniques they're using. It's designed to foster synchronicity. That's usually specifically what it's designed to do. If you sort of dig into this material, what people are talking about is, facilitating an outcome of events that is in line with what you had in mind, but is not sort of causally easily connectable. So what's the classic here? Like, you do a spell for money and you get a windfall or find 20 quid on the ground or whatever, right? So it seems to me that there's been a human preoccupation cross-culturally and for a long time with the production of synchronicity directly. And, if we look closely at sort of ritual context, a lot of it is designed to do that. Now, if you're designing something like a large group gathering, how do you do that? I assume a lot of it would be about sort of a set and setting, a mindset creating situation, keeping people relatively open, having them react with each other. So bringing a variety of people together with different frameworks and letting those things sort of react and cross-pollinate and analogize. But I suspect that also there are specific benefits to bringing, certain kinds of, synchronicity or alignment facilitating techniques to bear within a group setting, right? To create that sort of synchronistic possibility, or at least that, that's sort of the theory.
Yeah, right. One of the things which we spoke about the first time we met about 5 years ago, just under, was alchemy. And the way you express the meaning of that, and it was helped along by the fact I think I listened on a couple of very long car journeys to about 16 hours of you lecture on alchemy, which I again recommend to people.
Well, I applaud your endurance.
Yeah, we went down that rabbit hole. That was halfway across Australia, and yeah. And one of the analogies you used is you said, "Well, look, alchemy's a lot like cooking, a lot like cooking." And in the context of voicecraft, one of the things which we've begun to say is to see voicecraft dialogues as like aspiring to an alchemy of conversation. And opening that doorway for me is not a million miles away. It connects quite deeply to maybe what we could say about designing for synchronicity and attending to the set and setting in which various interactions are taking place. Slightly to the side of that, I feel the movement, whether more physically or less physically, circulating a space is quite important. And that's something which you can look at as a very clear and obvious constraint in terms of the design of a space, and promoting the desire to move through it in all dimensions in which various encounters can take place. When I think about the alchemy of conversation, and I think about the kind of relational context that can support the recognition of connectedness between so-called internal and external events, I think about intimacy, I think about trust, I think about vulnerability, and I think about how we bring ourselves and contribute our energy to the process of relating, and particularly to our openness to receive material, receive content, receive energy. And that's also an interesting way for me to sort of understand what it means to participate in influence that isn't immediately apparently describable in terms of that extrinsic application of causation. If I am open to another, if I'm open to receive, that's sort of a stance I take. It's not something anyone can necessarily see unless they themselves know what to look for. Interestingly, what's popping to my mind here is that a predator can very much, see whether or not there's vulnerability, as well as one might notice whether or not someone is actually receiving them and seeing them, so to speak, in that sense. So there's certainly profound risk when it comes to opening oneself up to receive. But maybe I'll stop there and just offer that in as how I'm approaching understanding what it is to support the kind of dropping into a field that is wanting to make possible connection between people and realization of our situatedness in culture now as beings here, and wanting to welcome more of reality into that process, while at the same time wanting to support the strength of being to meet that process. I haven't done all the pieces there, but what do you think about all of that? And in particular, the subtle, perhaps invisible ways we can orient our intentionality and our presence, how we can maybe tune in to each other and situations, which seems to have a tremendous influence in what then, of course, goes on to occur. But I'm not forcing it on anyone, obviously. I'm only one part in the brew. I'm only one ingredient in the alchemical mixture.
Yeah. I mean, to tie this back around in a sense to what you're saying about sort of the alchemy of conversation in that way, right? What is that alchemy? What is that experience? Jung, and as you flagged, I'm a well, Neo-Jungian, but certainly I have high respect. Jung talks about an encounter between any two sort of people as being like a chemical reaction, right? They both come away changed, right? So when two chemicals react, they are both changed. That's how that works, right? And, to some extent, sometimes what you're going to get is a sort of synthesis of them together into something that is, more complex, more differentiated, right? So I think really solid communication is communication that sort of, bridges across values and causes people to open their positions up and reconsider things and leverage the kind of basic empathy of perspective taking with other people in order to expand self, right? And that happens, between the two in a ideally mutually beneficial way, right? And when you get that happening at a larger group level, you're going to get a kind of, group effect there, right? So if you've ever done a project with a particular group of people where it was very intensive, right? There was a great deal of trading of, ideas and creative process and agency and the process of sort of effective collaboration when things are firing on all cylinders. And there is, I think, quite obviously something happening that's greater than the sum of its parts, right? Trivially speaking, in distributed cognition sense, but you get that kind of emergent quality. I think lots of people have talked about this in different ways. There is a fundamental problem, though. There's a fundamental lag, I think, which is at work there, and something that we deal with, not uniquely culturally, but we're dealing with a lot of it right now, which is, of course, the broad failure of trust. And the relationship between trust, transparency, trauma, how these things relate, right? If you don't trust, you don't sort of fluently integrate with a model of something, right? You keep checking it instead of just going with it. You keep looking at your glasses instead of looking through them, right? Instead of just using or being able to fluently sort of rely on something, you're constantly checking to make sure that it's working. So, that is necessary in some ways. It has to be the case that there has to be a certain amount of checking because, potentially speaking, there are bad actors, right? Or situations, right, which are not necessarily malevolent but are incompetent and can screw around with somebody's trust. But we're dealing with a very large scale breakdown of trust, I think. That's very obvious in people's relationships to social institution, right? To social institution of all kinds, right? Government, economic, religious, family, cultural, historical, you name it. And granted, like 100% caveat, there is to some extent, an aspect of this that is, what we once would have semi-smirkingly referred to as a first world problem. But I don't think that it's isolated. I think it's, this is meaning crisis stuff. I think it's sort of generalized. This breakdown of trust and the way that it filters down to even small scales, right? Where you see people socializing less, there's less sort of community connection. The promise of the internet, which was supposed to be this sort of, massive, wonderful, collaborative super village of villages or whatever, has not gone how we've expected, right? The downsides of it are very evident now. Not to say that there aren't upsides, but we're starting to get serious bills on the downsides. So this question around trust and how we establish it is really quite striking. And at the same time, not to go on too long, but we have a technological apparatus that increasingly wants to address this by removing trust, right? So crypto, for instance, right, is a good example of this. Not that I'm a crypto expert, I'm not. But part of the, sort of dominant thrust of this is that no trust is required. Well, except, of course, it is in practice. But the point is, that's a selling feature. So I think there are a bunch of factors, social factors, some by design and some separately, that have really atomized us. And the reestablishing of trust is going to be basically what we will need as the kernel of the rebuilding of our civilization. which is, sorry, that's kind of a heavy response on the question, but
No, absolutely.
Trust is an absolute crux, and it's it's in pretty bad shape socially.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm feeling two distinct energies here. One is to open and share some of my own extemporaneous contemplation on trust, which I'm sure will come through in some form. The other is that I'm feeling there's a bridge that's possible here to ask you about the cultivation of your work and your interests over the last 4 to 5 years, because it would strike me that if we are to consider the meaning of trust and what it could mean to rebuild it, then having a sense of who we are in relation to the world, how we are connected in a manner that can avail itself to at least a care for metaphysical sophistication, as well as an integration of the scientific mind and discursive process, is critical. Now, what I'll say for the listeners is that when Anders and I spoke about 5 years ago, at the end of one of those conversations, and we had 4 or 5, Anderson spoke about his interpretation of the Jungian notion of the unus mundus, which translates roughly to one world or something like this. So at the very least, if we're thinking about trust, we're thinking about communication that is sufficient to continue to be in process of understanding, living together, cohabiting in some very basic sense, in effect, to believe and know that we are part of the same territory, where that territory is one that also is of value. It's not just a sort of a dead map, but there's a world of care that we are actually inhabiting, and we can recognize each other as participating in that process with some degree of coherence and potential for ongoing relation. Now, there would be many ways to say something like this with more simplicity, perhaps, and more clarity. I'm just wanting to stretch to welcome big picture and a depth of metaphysics. And of course, I'm wanting to invite some of the depth of your own thinking in relation to the work you're doing, and to really invite you to bring forward how you are relating to the place of psyche in nature, and how our culture is relating to that conundrum.
Okay, big swings. This is why I like talking to you, Tim. Okay. So where do we want to jump in? Because you mentioned 2 streams, and one was the personal place, and the other was this sort of bigger question about how I'm relating into it. How do you want to come at it?
Well, I'd love to invite you to do both, because I feel like we've been speaking enough in this podcast now where I'm just, I'm interested to hear where Anderson has been, where the being of Anderson has been, and where he is now, and where he's looking, because for me, that's all deeply involved, because these conversations for me are part of a life of dedication and desire to deepen relationship and connect people, and to connect with place, and to build things together. And so these things are deeply connected for me, but finding your way into what you'd like to share is, of course, absolutely your prerogative. I'm here to listen.
Right. Well, that's not strictly speaking true. I mean, you are, but so am I.
For the next little bit.
It's dialogue.
Yeah.
Right. So where's Anderson been? Well, I can answer that question in, I suppose, a bunch of different ways. But, we haven't spoken we worked it out, 4 or 5 years? It's been a while.
Yeah.
And so, it's been a strange, a curious period, as I mentioned. Lots of quite substantial personal transitions on my own, life changes and so on. And I think that if you're, sort of honest in the work, you have to also be looking at the ground level of what's going on in your life to, pick up various trends and attempt to learn from things. As a dear friend of mine once said, and I've never forgotten, when I asked him why he continued to play competitive board games with his brother, who was considerably better than he was for the most part. And he lost about 2 times out of 3. And I could only handle a few of these Christmas get togethers before I was like, I want to win. But I said to him, like, I don't get it. What do you get out of this? And he said, well, you don't learn anything when you win. And that has really stuck with me over 25 years. So it's been an unusual period since I spoke with you last. And I think not just personally unusual, but, a strange time. So if, I've been making the joke since 2016 that, David Bowie left and stopped guarding the gates to reality. And that's when we dropped through to like cartoon land. Or sometimes what I say is, history repeats, first as tragedy, then as farce, and then as whatever this is. So, it's an interesting time. I have a broad set of interests, and aside from dealing with sort of the sort of psychic component of this and the psychoid component, which we'll get to, just the world in itself is fascinating. Competing sets of exponential curves. The rise of doom scrolling of numerous flavors like Baskin Robbins. It's weird. It's a weird, anxious time for people, right? And a time of very high uncertainty. And I think that when you're talking about convening sort of useful social synthesis or of this kind, trust is crucial, and the fact that it's in short supply is problematic because trust is what enables us to be tolerant of ambiguity and tolerant of novelty, right? So if indeed we're going to have, if indeed we're going to approach many of these sort of ill-formed problems that we're facing individually and collectively, but also, to whatever extent we're going to find new answers to new situations, right? We will require a degree of trust. Otherwise, it's very difficult to sort of onboard new ideas or have new thoughts, right? So, there are whatever we could sideline into game theory and talk about trust in that way, and there are some screwy results around competition and so on and so forth. But I think in general, when we're talking about trying to connect as individuals, yes, we have to have a balance. We have to have skepticism. We have to filter. We have to self-protect. We must do these things. But if we're really going to sort of move ahead and get someplace, we have to find a way back to being able to trust. And some of that, I suspect, means sort of smaller groups, right? This is not a new idea. This is like we massively exceed our Dunbar number and we're sort of freaking our Paleolithic brain out with the amount of contact we're having, and finding your way to a smaller subset, a group, a sangha, something of this kind where you can vet to some extent and build to some extent, right? And active movements in this direction. So it's an extremely curious period. I spend a lot of time thinking about trust because it's central to therapeutic operation in many ways, right? If you don't have it, it's really difficult to get anywhere and you have to earn it. But also because it's so clearly a factor in trauma specifically. So for instance, take the much discussed concept of gaslighting, right? Gaslighting has become one of these, sort of du jour terms that's very TikToked, as it were, if I can coin a horrible verb. TikToked? Adjective? I don't know, whatever. It's been TikToked. And, so what's happening there? Well, the classic version in the sort of noir film is, the husband keeps changing things around when the wife isn't looking to convince her that she's lost her mind, right? And then the gaslighting part is being like, what are you talking about? The lamp was always over there, and can you get her to crack up, right? And clearly, this is operating at numerous levels all the time in people's exchanges, right? So the simplest version of this that I typically reference is, if your father says, and I'm sorry if I prod anyone's personal sore spot with this generalized anecdote, but if your father says, "Absolutely, son, I'll come to your footy game next week and see you kick the ball for victory," and he doesn't show up, you will probably write that off and say, "Well, whatever, Dad had a meeting." And if he does it again, right, and doesn't show up, you'll be like, "Oh, okay, well, I'm disappointed, but whatever." And if he does it again, you're going to what? Stop believing that he's going to show up, right? So he will drive a wedge gradually between what he says and what he does, such that you no longer treat what he says as predictive, right? You no longer treat, if he says he's going to do it, you just don't believe him. And because of that, it's not just that in general you don't believe he's going to come to your game, it's that you believe that his words are worthless because they don't indicate the truth. The same thing goes in parenting, broadly speaking, right? Where a lot of the time, and I'm inclined to believe that lots of parents are stricter than I would typically advocate. And a lot of that has to do with, frankly, being in over their head, right? Kids don't come with a manual. Everybody is making it up. You mostly pull ideas that your parents or grandparents had in a pinch because you're overwhelmed. But, there's a tendency to really inconsistently apply. They say, well, you're going to catch hell, but then they don't hold it, right? The kid throws a tantrum or something and they cave. And then again, what you say, we're going to take away your PlayStation, and what you do is highly divorced. The same goes for social institutions. If they say, "We love you and we're going to take care of you and we love you," and then they screw you, right? You are probably going to develop a trust issue. Where trust becomes really problematic, though, is when the situation begins to undermine your own trust in your own modeling abilities, right? So it's one thing to distrust a specific person. If that happens early enough or significantly enough, then you'll apply that, you'll blur it out to a category, right? This is the very definition of what we would normally call something like baggage, right? Romantic baggage is overgeneralizing your previous experiences to your future experiences, right? Where it's not a good fit and you have to differentiate. If, on the other hand, right, you have a set of experiences where your own modeling capacity starts to get undermined. And how does that happen? Well, first it's an individual, then it's a cluster of individuals or something, or a really important individual like a parent. This drops your sense of trust, right? But as it starts to generalize across more and more people, imagine dating 10 people in a row and thinking all of them, this one's different, and then they're not. You start to erode your own sense of your ability to determine what is real. And it's at that point that you typically start to see, in one way or another, like dissociative effects, right? So you get, derealization. The world stops seeming real. Well, because your models of it aren't transparent anymore, right? Or depersonalization. Your sense of self no longer seems real, right? Because, I don't know, you've behaved in inconsistent ways. Your emotional motivations are clashing with what you're actually doing, various kinds of things. So there's a kind of dissociative effect that begins to creep up, right? And that's, sort of what's so insidious about that is that it's undermining your modeling abilities, your sense of connection with the world, and an ability to like predict and navigate and cope, right? So I think what we're dealing with is really large scale. There's this background issue, which is a kind of erosion, and that's interpersonal and has probably to some extent always been there, right? I don't think it's new to have the idea that people are undermining each other in this way. They're humans. This is something that we've done. It's a disaster, but it is nevertheless something that we've done. And who knows, maybe we'll even find that to some extent that's useful. It's hard to imagine how, since it seems to drop functionality, but some amount of it, right? You need to develop a certain amount of callous or skepticism, probably. But then when it comes to social organizations and stuff, right, and with the world at large, this gap and the erosion between, what we think and what's real, or our ability to feel like we're in contact with the real in some way is, I think, a sort of an enormous danger. This sort of like just dissociative abyss. And don't get me wrong, dissociation, it's a spectrum and a state like any other. It has its uses. It's a natural part of the system. But when you get it ramped up to a certain level where it's really affecting how people interact, how they connect, how they process, how they flourish or fail to, right? Then you're into sort of larger territory. How we overcome that trust question? Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. There's no easy answer. And I think that there are, quite a few various impacts, forces, influences, dynamics, however you want to put that have, I would say, sort of an interest in eroding it, right? Or in substituting for it in various ways. So there are also self-interested parties, which is one of the things. It's not just sort of random hurt or random distrust. It's, planned distrust. Sorry, this is bleak stuff, huh? It isn't. You can tell I'm smiling, but
yeah, no, I think that was an awesome fleshing out on the way that trust can degrade. I mean, a couple things pop to mind. I'll say a few of them. One is just, someone like Elon Musk can be totally for democracy, in quotation marks, if he can basically control what people will think and how they will vote. And so this speaks to just an example of the way in which various insidious influences on our perspectives can compromise even what we look to at another level of culture as, in this case, the institution of democracy, that we can be ignorant of the ways in which we're being hollowed out, I think is quite fascinating. I mean, you spoke to some of the insidious aspects of it. There's another notion that came to me several years ago. I wrote about it only briefly. I've shared it on the podcast once or twice. And it was the notion of hacking synchronicity.
Yes.
And I think that in a world in which everything from potentially our own dream material to what we share to technology, our purchasing habits, hopes, dreams, fears of those we might be living with or in our neighborhood, according to, our IP address, is all in principle available to very powerful algorithms, a tremendous amount of data that could very much and very easily suggest to you in a digital experience something which you thought you were just experiencing quite in a hermeneutically sealed vacuum of your own living room or in your own relationship. And so the way in which even our relationship to external phenomena and their influence on internal phenomena, I think the digital context presents a very interesting new medium to really mess with our intuitions and our perceptions around such things, even as synchronicity and what we feel attracted to. And so that further complicates this prospect of trust when seemingly the requirement to cultivate a strength of, but also a dexterity of immune response to the assailing of information is absolutely wild. So I'll say one other thing, which is maybe can draw towards the possibility for response in relation to this rather than just layering on the ways that we can have our trust challenged. Where would be the direction there? Well, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Did you have a?
There was,
I
I'll
have a
just
thought,
say
but
one
go
thing,
ahead.
just it was the crystallization of just, it was, so I sort of underwent the very process that we might end up speaking about here, because I was going to reflect on the process of tuning in to my own orientation in relation to that. And then the sense of integrity and the feeling toward integrity of what it would be in this case to share voice, but also maybe more fundamentally to attend to the relationship between us as we just did there, as a way of coordinating how we're relating to the context itself, which doesn't require us to have the answer already to all these
Mhm.
grand things. And yet we can deepen and strengthen in our process of situating ourselves. And so that's been the core of a lot of, I would say, my work or hope and effort to invite and connect. And of course, would be part of relationships as such. I mean, certainly therapeutic relationships. You were speaking about trust in that context before, so I'll hand it back over to you.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. I have obviously well, I suppose as everyone does, a highly specific view. But I think also in this respect, I have a fairly kind of idiosyncratic and to some extent, not really aligned with the zeitgeist of the times in a way. And one of the articles of faith in the whatever bipartisan religion of progress that I think we're seeing crumble a bit, significantly actually, is that one sort of largely is supposed to sort of onboard modernity in a relatively uncritical way, right? So, I can recall having a conversation with dear friends years ago after I left the screening of, that Facebook movie, The Social Network, the Aaron Sorkin Facebook movie, and I was not a Facebook user, and I remain not a Facebook user. Something that stirs up a lot in people. Years ago I had people set accounts up for me, which I then had to unset up. I had many people tell me I sort of had to. And leaving this film, my friends were like, well, there comes a time when, you onboard your last technology and that's like where you get stuck. And then you're a stagnant old person who refuses to learn to program their VCR, right? Okay, sure, there is some quality to that, I think. But I have always had a certain kind of, I guess, admiration for the sort of Amish or Mennonite perspective of the selective uptake of technology, right? You can have a phone in the barn because that's good, but not a phone in the house because that's maybe not so good, right? Maybe it's better that you get together with your neighbors to discuss things, but you want to have a phone in the barn in case you get a medical emergency. That's kind of a strange example, but they're sort of selective in their onboarding, right? They judge technologies on a case-by-case basis. I think that, again, when I'm considering this question of sort of curating, in some sense, one's own experience for their flourishing, a lot of it is about, again, a kind of magical principle, which is the drawing of the magic circle, right? The drawing of the magic circle, the creation of a boundary or a closed vessel, right? Where you then are making decisions about what crosses this and what doesn't. You are making decisions about what enters and what does not, right? So, the way that cashes out in therapy is typically pretty straightforward. You encourage people to set boundaries of blah, blah, blah. It's an issue that people already have. You can tell by that boundary crossing that this is an issue people already have. They feel like they don't have control. But as far as information goes, we've moved, and this is a kind of, I don't know, like a quasi McLuhan sort of take, I guess. But as we move through a set of technologies, the interaction that we have with those technologies changes considerably. So, reading a book is a curated technology, right? Somebody out there, a set of editors, a set of authors, like it's come through a set of people. And they have made some decisions, and some of those obviously are self-serving or serving the system in various ways, right? We know this. It's, everything is theory laden, so you don't get away from that in books. But you have to sort of seek a book out unless the education system comes and says, you must read this in order to pass this grade, right? Otherwise, and hopefully they're doing that in a responsible fashion that, again, is encouraging, flourishing. But otherwise, you seek it out. Something like radio, right, comes to us. We turn the box on, it's broadcast, we hear the voice in our ear. And I think the rise, the recent constant re-rise of podcasts since the introduction of the iPod is an interesting medium because it allows for long form, it's relatively narrowcast, but it also talks into your ear, right? There's the velvety and intimate quality that I think sometimes isn't even really captured in video, right? The radio is a different beast than the television. Then we get to something like television, and again, it's culturally concentrating, it's narrowcasted. Everybody goes and talks about the episode of whatever when they gather around the cooler, right? But since then, we've moved into this sort of super saturated information environment. The availability is enormous, right? And so we needed some mechanism to, partly to profit off of it, but it's the algorithm. So when the algorithm is deciding your content, you've at some level abdicated, right? You've abdicated. And the fact that we know that algorithmic content is designed to provoke certain outcomes that are not necessarily for you, because if the product is free, right, you're the product, right? It's about hoovering up your data. It's about maximizing your engagement. It's about capturing your attention. So, there are, baldly, numerous actors who are interested in capitalizing on this stream, and for all variety, to sell you a pair of shoes, to influence how you think, to whatever. The algorithm really abdicates a kind of control about what's coming across, and that doesn't mean that you can't maintain sort of critical thinking and so on and so forth, but that is a really difficult skill actually for people to develop, and the sort of modern information framework actually, if anything, maybe makes it harder, right? Getting people outside of an echo chamber, for instance. So one example of this, if I may, which I was thinking about recently, and I've spoken about before, but when I was growing up in the early days of the internet, I remember when the web dropped, and I had used the internet prior to that, but the web dropped and there was suddenly a lot of information, and I assumed at that time that the generation coming up now would be sort of, I don't know, like a Google native, right? They would be able to perfectly swim these streams of information. And a dear friend of mine, who's a philosophy prof now, said, if I had had access to this technology as a lad, I would probably know, plasma physics. And I said, I wouldn't. I would just be the world's greatest expert on Bigfoot. Like, my childhood sensibilities would have led me to certain things, So there's that. But the other part of this is that I am very cognizant of having come up in an information regime which required certain kinds of well-formed strings in order to locate pre-curated information. So if you went to a library and you had to use a card catalog, right, you would have to sort of write down what you thought you were looking for, code it into the Dewey Decimal System, right? And then you would go flip through the card catalog and see if there was something that matched that string. And there might be, but there also might not. And if you were looking for something quite specific, you'd then have to sort of reformulate a few different strings. The same thing was true of early search engines, right? You could go and formulate a string, and you might find something, but you might not. Or you might find something of such a low quality that it was pretty obviously not, useful to you. But that is not the situation anymore. It does not matter what you type into Google. You will get 100 million results. So unless you already have a system or somebody in place to be able to go through and assess the quality of that information, it's just going to scream at you with a bunch of unfiltered confirmation bias and garbage because of your search string. Now, it's not that that wasn't true before, but it was narrowed, pre-filtered, right? You had to really think about multiple ways of coming at something to find anything. Whereas now you can find as much as you like. And that is, if anything, amplified in what we quaintly call hallucinations in something like an LLM, which is increasingly being used to sort of replace this space. The fact that it confabulates so easily, I suspect, doesn't actually make it significantly different than us, because we also confabulate all over the place. Everybody keeps going, well, we want it to operate like humans. It's like, yeah, it does. That's the problem. The problem is that it hallucinates exactly like we do, and that it confabulates exactly like we do. But, you're always going to get an answer, or very almost always, regardless of the quality of your query. And there's no good filter in that, you see? So a few years ago, and this is, I suppose, one of the benefits of being a Neo-Jungian, every once in a while you get one of these gold bricks dropped on you by one of the higher levels of the psyche, and it sort of smacks into your ego and gives you a bit of a rude shock. But maybe 2018, I was standing in front of my library, as I sometimes do, and I'm just eyeballing it. I'm caressing the books with my eyeballs because it's nice to have a library. And I was thinking, I'd like to read this, and I'd like to reread that. And all of a sudden, I have this intrusion, which I would not describe as being an actual auditory hallucination, but had the discrete sort of quality of being distinct from my consciousness and pushing into my consciousness, if you know what I mean. And it said just very simply, I think while I was looking at Goethe, it said very simply, you should spend less time paying attention to history and more time paying attention to eternity. And as I often do in these circumstances, I said, that's great. What? Like, what am I supposed to do with that? Which that's what it's like when you're working with these pieces of yourself. But, to that end, I think that it's not equally available to everybody, but people would benefit, I suspect, from being more conscious about the kinds of information and the modes of information that they're taking in. If it's algorithmic, there's the simple part, which is like, well, I know it's controlled, and so it won't control me. That's horseshit. We know that that's not true. If that were true, the advertising industry would have completely collapsed, many, many years ago. It is influencing you. And so the answer that you have to that is, if you want to regain a certain amount of autonomy, you need to be able to set the magic circle and say what comes in and what doesn't. Right? This is very hard. It's really, really difficult. So, yeah. Does that?
Yeah. So a couple of things are coming up. So the notion of the magic circle, I also think about membranes. I think about that which wants to attract certain qualities or possibilities in, but is also repelling certain things out. And there's another piece here. Just give me a few moments to reconnect with it. Yeah, to do with LLMs and humans and our confabulation, the hallucination. Now, my experience of both with LLMs and some human beings, LLMs are maybe a clear example to make. They're quite keen to please. Now, of course, this is partly as a result of the business models of their creators, perhaps, or the necessity of behaving in a certain way so that the user chooses their product and not another one, even if, again, you're not paying a subscription, you are handing over your data to the Chinese government is the alternative, or whoever else. Of course, with human beings as well, and of course with children, in our mimicking is not necessarily obviously exactly the same thing as just wanting to please someone, but there's an interesting link insofar as that sort of default behavior of the child in order to learn involves the copying of someone else who's doing something that seems to be a good idea or not.
Sure. Yeah. Mimesis and internalization, sort of Vygotskian internalization. Sure.
Right. And so there's that. And so to reintegrate Jung, there's of course this sense in which we are born into a a being of possibility that is at the beginning of its individuation journey, and of course comes pre-given with a whole range of capacities. And from a Jungian perspective, we spoke last time, you gave a really nice description of a way into understanding the notion of archetypes. So we might have a sense of how to relate to the caregiver, and you gave a great example of the gosling and the goose and the imprinting at a certain age on just about anything, because there's this pre-given desire to shape accordingly relative to certain energies. My point in naming a whole bunch of these things, from desiring to please to retain attention, how far away is this? There's a link here to sometimes our absence, perhaps, of critical thinking, our absence of choosing not to do something with the kind of skillfulness of discernment that one would associate with a magic circle, right? It's not some bullshit thing of I don't want that because of whatever. There's presumably some cultivated intuitive capacity that interacts with the membrane so as to actually more reliably create the conditions for a certain kind of quality of exchange and possibility to take place. So I'm saying all this because I'm sort of orbiting around the ways in which I'm interested in the kind of skills and the context that support the kind of skillfulness in relationship that supports, again, this cultivation of trust in recognition of some of these dynamics which reliably have us fall into patterns of whether it's pure mimesis or pleasing or hallucinating in order to give the answer that we think is expected of us, whether from the left hemisphere to the right hemisphere. Even at that level, this desire to come into conformity seems to be so powerfully strong that we can be oriented by various forces, internal and external, towards conforming this way and that way. And the process of real co-navigation in relation there can be, you can jack into that process at a level that can inhibit the possibility for, lighting up this world together ultimately, and maybe something like that, or cultivating warmth together. And so, I'm always amazed at how with this, what I'm trying to get better at doing is to be able to bring to awareness a little bit more the ways in which our presence together and our orientation and our ideas are already influenced in some important way, or can already be influenced, but that we also don't just have the luxury of tapping into the answer of just what those influences are, and that in some critical sense, what we are looking through, while we can take off the spectacles and look at the lenses, there's this sense in which we are always necessarily looking through a lens. Forrest Landry, a philosopher, in the last episode of the podcast, or two when this is released, said something about light doesn't collide with light. So light passes through light without resistance, something like this. And so perceiving cannot get a total glance at the perceiver in some critical sense. And
Sure.
And the notion of archetypes has always been interesting to me in relation to this, because my walk around frame for many years in relation was that archetypes were a way of understanding the manner by which our lenses of perception were reliably conditioned into certain patterns and orientations for living and relating. And we spoke about what it means to sort of participate in the evolution of archetypes as such. And you see, so the tuning into the process of understanding what mode of perception is crystallizing in us is super, super interesting. It doesn't get us the whole way of trying to solve these problems, but it does something like that has just remained a continued fascination to me.
Yeah. I mean, I think, in talking about this, where we potentially open up, not that it's a bad thing, but, a substantial can of worms around, questions of sort of what we're getting at when we're getting at the archetype, right? I, as I've mentioned before, I try to keep, a few different potential frames of interpretation on hand, right? So that I don't get sort of sclerotic in my application or my interpretation of things. But one of them that I do consider pretty readily is, this question of whether or not the archetype, such as it is evolved and thus closely involved biologically speaking, right? Because if that's the case, right, then it raises some questions about whether or not we are sort of archetypally prepared for what's emerging. So, one way of thinking about this is to sort of say, well, the archetypes are eternal and they are always structuring the most basic patterns of reality, and therefore they can take anything you can throw at them, sort of thing, and we can recache it. Or if you want to come at this in a slightly different way, the archetypes, define at some level the fundamental categories by which we are processing things. And so no matter what comes up, we're going to see it in those terms. Right? We're going to tend to process things into sort of archetypal images because that's what we have to work with, right? So those are two possibilities. But a third possibility is that, our archetypes in some sense, that I've considered may not have caught up with us yet. If our archetypes are an evolved process, right? Or if they're tied in some way to our evolution and our biology, which they certainly could be, right? Are we moving past the realm that the archetypes are have good explanatory power? Do they need to be revised? Do there need to be additions to the pantheon? That's an interesting question. And it, for me anyway, it gets between a kind of perennial quality to the archetypes where, no matter what, we can look, if you learn your way around, that will serve you. Right. And I think that's true to some extent too. Wait, are we actually dealing with new things? One of the areas that I think about this, and I think it's relevant if what we're talking about is sort of establishing your ground relative to the world in the way that people, I think, who are after archetypes are looking, right? They're looking for handles to interpret and operate. We have a lot of modern phenomena that are not historical phenomena, right? Really big populations with large amounts of communication between them is, so far as we know, Graham Hancock notwithstanding, unique to the modern period, right? Certainly we don't see any indication that there's ever been anything resembling, global telecommunications networks, right? This kind of thing, and this ability of interconnection. So what are the emergent forces there? Likewise, we have plenty of mythology, and certainly, mythology not in its sort of pejorative sense of falsehood, but as a structuring narrative, right? Around the concept of creating beings, right? And it goes back, whatever, you can look at the homunculus, or you can look at, Pygmalion, or you can look at Pinocchio, or you can look at, right? We have stories about the creation of beings in this way, but that may or may not turn out to be applicable, right, in some sense to the circumstance that we find ourselves in, where, the rise of, I've always had a bit of a sticking point around the term artificial intelligence, and I've always preferred emulated intelligence, although it may in fact turn out that it is whatever, that it does have interiority. I'm open to that. But we're coming into a period that I think is in some ways radically different than what we've dealt with up to this point. So does the framework that we've got archetypally serve in that way? I've given speculations in the past about my concerns, for instance, that our culture has sort of drained a lot of the efficacy, for instance, out of the hero's journey. And while on one hand, right, that's a mythic structure and an archetypal structure that is sort of evergreen and can always be recoded, like there's no question that there are industries that are devoted to recoding it as fast as possible and feeding it back to us over and over and over and over and over again, right? I don't know how much money the Marvel machine has made, but it's a lot. And right, they're banking on this, and that comes straight out of Star Wars, which itself, it deliberately applied these kinds of ideas to try to get that kind of mythic kick. So, the era of the blockbuster is an era of sort of having this fire hose of a specific myth, the kind of thing that we might have only had in tribal dribs or drabs or certain sacred stories and things. What's the effect of that? I think about it sometimes in the same way as I think about the other kinds of hypertrophic and hijacking technologies that we have. So fast food is a kind of hypertrophic stimulus, right? It's like food, except it's engineered to hit this bliss point so that it's kind of gross, but it's also designed to be like, you don't even have to chew it, and it hits this perfect bliss point space, like it's chemically engineered, and as such is often more appealing than, the apple. Maybe with a tiny wormhole or something on it, right? Likewise, there's many, many cases of this. We get nonstop streaming stories beamed in anytime we want. We're in a hypertrophic state of sort of digital, constant super connection with other people, texts, et cetera, and you only have to look at the effect that has on young people. 2 minutes goes by without receiving a response, and they're in something of a mild panic. Right, that they're being socially shut out. Well, that's very new, right? To be in that all the time. Video games, which are basically flow hijacking machines. And I like video games. I like games in general. I like them, but I'm also very wary of them because there's, right, anybody that doubts that they are, we can quibble about the term addictive, but compulsive, right, is not paying attention. The move of gamification, which in many ways is just sort of an application of gambling technologies into other modes, right, is a big deal. So what I'm saying is, right, there are all of these sort of hypertrophic stimuli. And it seems to me that one of the things that AI or EI is doing is creating another form of hypertrophic stimulus, right? Now, we can ask ourselves, like, well, what happens if we start to substitute hypertrophic illusion for reality? And one of the things that I think happens, if that happens exclusively, is that you lose the opportunity for a certain kind of subtle discernment, right? And you brought up discernment with sort of the magic circle, right? And discernment is also this central thing that you're attempting to cultivate in a practice like mindfulness, for instance. Or if you're engaged in any kind of intentional self-transformation, what's rule one? Rule one is like you need a steady, sprinkling of know thyself, right? You need to be learning these subtle patterns in yourself. You need to be observing yourself. You need to be attempting to deconstruct some of your automaticity in that observation. Why? Well, because unless you can tune yourself into that kind of thing, you lose out on the subtlety that is necessary to create a kind of connoisseurship of your experience, right? Connoisseurship, picking up these fine notes. If you want to pick up the fine notes, you have to, right? You have to be focused on this subtle thing, right? And the hypertrophic is like, it's like a wall of noise kind of situation. I think there are advantages to that in some ways. I am not opposed to altered states, and there's no question those things provoke altered states, and altered states can be useful. But against a biological baseline, right? We need, yes, fine, go down into the kaleidoscope chamber with the strobe lights and the blasting house music and whatever else you brought in there with you. Fine. But also we need silence, quiet fires, stars with skies in them, small groups of people, right? And it's not about a fundamental sort of normative valence towards that. It's rather that if we don't get some familiarity there, we don't develop any acuity at that end of things,
Mm.
right? And sorry, I'm kind of bopping around here substantially, but do you see what I mean?
Yes. When I think in my incredibly rudimentary understanding of alchemy from any technical perspective, in terms of the history of how such things we're speaking about, which largely comes through yourself, and I'm not wishing to bring in any claim to authority at all in relation here, and yet nevertheless I'm going to attempt to use some concepts.
Yeah, take a swing at it. I don't know that much.
Yeah. Well, just at the level of fire, right? At the level of flame, thinking about elements. When I experience the energy of my own being in relation to another, in that sense, when I come to awareness about how I'm influencing a situation, I have the opportunity to connect my sense of influence to the quality of how I am conduiting energy. In this case, how I'm using my voice. There's a sense in which, metaphorically, the fire as an expression of energy that is always, flickering and taking on a impossible to define shape, and yet it illuminates. And so we can come to see other shapes that the fire is illuminating. The fire here I'm seeing as critical to the alchemy of the energy of expression that illuminates. And I'm seeing the archetype in the sense of the primordial images exemplified in Marvel and what have you as the illuminated hero who has certain qualities and capacities and what have you, but is more or less playing a role not a million miles away from the shadows telling a story on the wall of Plato's cave. And yet, without the fire, we would not be seeing those forms play out. Part of the intensity of this questioning that we're sort of doing is reckoning with the attention we can pay to the quality of whether it's natural intelligence, right, as distinct from artificial or emulated. And this is a bit of a stretch for me, but in some conversations I've explored a way to distinguish these modes of intelligence without claiming to exhaust this whatsoever as the capacity to undergo a certain kind of transcendent move, in that sense, to be able to move whether transcontextually or step beyond the limitations of a particular context and the dictates
to develop.
To develop, to cultivate, to relate with the mystery of that which influences context. And here we are right at the point of it, because I'm going to link one other piece here, which is how Peter Kingsley speaks about the notion of prophecy, largely wanting to point toward the capacity to tune in my language, to the living history of the world, kind of a Whiteheadian process philosophy type thing of,
right.
But that the past bleeding through into the present, and that the prophets call as not being, here is some prediction of future events necessarily, but here is this kind of like radical in the sense of return to the roots from which to update the nutrient context of the present. Again, you ain't finding that in Kingsley, but that's how I'm trying to.
That's okay. That's okay. It's all good here. It's a big alchemical brew,
right? And so part of this challenge is this represencing of the recognition of our movement and flow and being and orientation to becoming through our activity that we find ourselves in now. And there's always this desire to want for the answers. Just give me that perfectly illuminated thing. But there's something about our treatment of the process and our recognition of, in a sense, the fire. You could probably plug in other elements in the alchemical brew that we can become attendant to. It turns out I didn't know I was this spice for you, to be totally honest. I've just been eating Japanese my whole life. But it turns out you put a bit of soy in this, and all of a sudden it maybe doesn't go so well. But I was just over here being some soy, in this. And so there's something remarkable about our strengthening of capacity to recognize how we are socially, naturally influencing situations which we might not be aware of. We can come to cultivate more of a relation with that. And that seems to me to be actually it's a call towards something that is actually quite optimistic, like a source of genuine strengthening resolve. I find at a very local level of just, well, I've been in this situation before and I've made it worse last time. Oh shit, I made it even worse this time. Maybe next time, not so much. I try this other thing. I try this other way. And there's something very special about these coming to attention of moments of profound criticality. They don't always have to be critical moments. We do seem to get a sense of the sort of the energy as it channels through our unique vessel. And even though we don't get to bookend, I love Jung speaking about, a human being wakes up and the story's already begun, and the end can only be vaguely hinted at. There's a sense of there's always this next chapter. And the kind of endings I like are the ones that lead to new beginnings. And so where really is the ending? Something like this, right? There's something of a deep resolve I find there, just in that simplicity of attending to how we are involved in the communicational field and the possibility for depth and understanding and all of that. And so my questions continue to return to what supports the conditions to enter and participate in more of the more qualitatively enriching and mutually educing and strengthening ways of being together, whether you want to talk about play or what have you. And I want to do that final thing. I want to do that without falling to the kind of naivety that would forever preclude the possibility of relating with the real violence of death and war and power, right? That somehow I'm not interested in anyone's magic circle if it can't relate with the intensity of war, which isn't to say that the young magician should be capable of taking on Vladimir Putin, but there's got to be something of a continued relating with the flows of real power in our time, so as to not fool ourselves about what kind of communication and vulnerability and intimacy is possible to open into in any particular context.
Right. Okay. So that's a big thing to bite off. But I mean, what I will say is that, okay, sort of working backwards in a sense, no magician's magic circle is worth a damn if it doesn't allow he, she, they to productively work with a variety of forces, some of which we might refer to as demons. And you can take that at a big abstraction, and I'm not advocating for diabolism or demonology per se, but no magic circle is worth a damn if it doesn't let you work around the situation that you have with demons, which I'll unpack, more broadly. It's sort of a few different levels of analysis. We as humans are facing, in some ways, a set of, I think, unprecedented, right? In some ways, right? Whether or not they can be sort of archetypally folded and understood, maybe. And, as I've said before, right, one of these claims that Jung, sort of prophetically, to link into your stuff around Kingsley, is talking about, and Kingsley talks about this too. He talks about it in Catafalque, and he talks about it in that big honking burglar knocking out book, Reality. Reality should be a big book or a very thin pamphlet. But anyway, he talks about this, and, one of the things that Jung sort of says in this respect in Ion is that, we're moving into the age of Aquarius, and take whatever you will, the astrological mode. I have my own issues there, but just as a metaphor for a second, we're moving into this age. We're moving out of the Piscean age and into the Aquarian age. And these ages occur in long developmental periods. And so, right now we're seeing the breakdown of the old order. And what we should see is a new civilization emerging. Okay, good. With you so far, I'm thinking, in about 600 years. And that gobsmacked me, partly because I'm a child of the 1970s and thus came of age in the 90s. And so the idea of sort of like millennial immanentism and, the whole, like, it's all happening right now. Now, there is a lot happening right now. I think we're dealing with some really deeply fundamental existential issues. And I say existential with a variety of different modes of construal here, right? There are certain outcomes of our civilization and our collective behavior, which are clearly kind of epical and that are coming home to roost. And I think anybody that is in broad denial about this is probably dealing with a complex, right? Even if you sort of have issues with some of the specifics, I don't think it takes too much to figure out that, like, dude, everything's on fire. How long do you pretend that's not happening, right? That's new. It's not that, we didn't start the fire. It was always burning it's burning a hell of a lot more now. So, right? Okay. It's an existential issue, one that we have to face, whatever, as a collective, as a species, whatever that means. A species which is comprised of individuals, which I have issues with that term, individual, because I don't think it's true. I think we are very individual, but leaving that for a second. Okay. And then we have something else. And this is, I think, my point around the kind of, triumph of a certain kind of illusion, right? Even if it's an illusion which we have a certain degree of control over, in the sort of output of emulated intelligence systems of various kinds, be they sort of LLMs, various other kinds of neural network, what we would call AI systems that can spit things out. So I don't know to what extent you've monkeyed with these things. I spend a lot of time with it and consult with people about it, because even though they make me uncomfortable, I do try to stay as close to the edge as I am capable of understanding, less a specialist developer, code rule or something, vibe coding aside. Right. So what are we dealing with here? Well, one of the things we're dealing with is something that I think potentially has the threat, basically, of being more engaging than people. This is one of the problems. This has been suggested a lot around stuff with kids and screen time, for instance, right? A perennial hot topic among young parents. How much screen time, right? And I remember when my sister's children were young and I was looking after them. Before they were born, I had a very hard policy. No TV. I thought TV is bad because TV is bad. But, no TV until I was actually looking after them. And then it turns out that the Hypnobox has a lot of utility if you want to make lunch, right? And so we make these concessions, even if, right, we let that kind of happen. Same thing with screen time. One of the things with screen time is this. Even though it's a smooth black glass surface, the black mirror, as it were, it is highly responsive. It's highly responsive, and you don't have to compete for its attention if you have the object, right? That is not what being a child is like. Children compete for attention, and they compete for certain kinds of output, right? And, yes, it's not just about getting positive reinforcement, but that is partly what it is. It gives other people give us their attention. We are reinforced by that attention. They shape us with that attention, right? They give us an emotional structure and a comfort zone, right? And a sense of security. And this is, in no small part what parenting is, right? Producing that sense of safety and allowing for exploration while guarding against harm, blah, blah, blah. So the device just gives you what you want. It's a hypertrophic stimulus. And increasingly, it seems to me, and across a bunch of different domains, it's a hypertrophic stimulus that's substituting for a bunch of the normal social domains. And all the more so, we're going to find out whether or not sort of COVID was a hiccup in the social situation, or whether or not it merely accelerated a trend that was already existing. But online interactions instead of offline interactions. And look, we're on opposite sides of the planet. You're at the antipode, or I am, depending on your perspective, right? So it's not easy for us to do this in any other way. So great, this serves certain useful functions, right? But, although people, I think, got the sense over the pandemic that, like, Christ, I don't want to live my life in video space, right? Nevertheless, online interactions are, in some ways, the dominant form. Online dating, for instance, something like Tinder, has swamped, basically eradicated more conventional forms of dating, and for better and for ill in some ways, right? It's clearly the street finds its own uses, per William Gibson. So, people are using these technologies in their own ways, but the technology itself is shaping interactions in some ways. So if we look at, for instance, numerous pieces of reporting and study, and this might all get overturned, but showing that that online accessibility in sort of partnership is corrosive to relationship stability, right? Now, I have a biased sample, clinically speaking, when I'm talking about clients and interactions, but nevertheless, it's a trend line. I see it. Okay, take another example. I was working a while ago with a startup, and one of the things that they were working on was a sort of AI clone of me. That's a whole separate story. Deeply eerie to have something say something that you didn't say but might have said in your voice. Let me tell you, it was a real, like, oh God, is it going to throttle me from the mirror kind of moment. But interesting, and I'm sufficiently sort of high openness that I'm willing to do that anyway, even though it frightens me, just because, like, let's just see what happens, which might be my downfall. But one of the things that came out of this in the discussions was this concept of, we were talking at length about using these sorts of tools for things like romantic coaching, right? Helping somebody work through a breakup, for instance, or something. And one of the things that gradually emerged in the conversations was that there seemed to be far more demand from people, not for something that would help them work through the snags and difficulties of real human relatedness, so much as substitute for real human relatedness. There was a clear subset of young professionals, for instance, who directly said what they wanted basically was an AI or EI girlfriend or boyfriend or partner, whatever, that, right, will never judge, never blame, always be supportive, listen to them talk about their day, right? None of the friction of normal, none of the give and take of normal human relations. Right? Now, we can say maybe that's a failure of human relations, right? And we do have specifically formatted relations, right? There are social institutions. Therapy is one of them, right? In its 1,000 forms. But so is something like the confessional, which is a particular kind of mediated asymmetrical form of relationship, right? And it's one that nevertheless has friction. There's a reason you have it in a box where you can't see each other and like these various things. So in the same way as we are leaning towards other kinds of hypertrophic stimuli that tend to hijack us in that way, one of the concerns I think we face, aside from general existential concerns about our survival as a species, because we're just that, a species, and like other species have, they have their time, except the noble cockroach, may it rule forever, and bacteria that have us all beat. Right, we're all latecomers and peripheral players compared to bacteria. But the point is, there are these hypertrophic stimuli, and the question is going to be this: twofold, I think. One, how do we sensitize people to the value that is inherent in a difficult interaction, a difficult relationship, which is what human relationships are, right? They require work. We get bruised. There's give and take. There's turn taking. There's all these things that we have to internalize. It's not easy for everybody to do. When you look at people who have social anxiety, or, right, I work with a lot of people on the spectrum, and the rules of socializing are arcane and counterintuitive and often say that they're one thing when in fact they're something else, right? Okay, that as opposed to the thing that always listens. You know, and the other half of this is, aside from that, the friction piece, the other question, of course, is going to be what? Well, okay, so it's a deeper question, and it's a question about finding our own human value in a world where the machine does what we do better. And does it do everything we do better? This is a live question, and it's one that we're going to see be absolutely an earthquake, right? It's starting. I had a very, very interesting experience last week that plugs into this. But, you know, these are some of the big questions I think that we need to answer, is like, well, what is the value in human interaction? We can't take that as a given, especially if there's an alternative, unless we're going to start throwing our clogs into the machine in a Butlerian jihad, you know, a little Dune reference there. Sorry, that's again a lot. But can I unpack this? Can I unpack Please. The one thing that hit me? Because it's plugged in and you got me on a roll a bit. So last week, and as of now, it's the 26th of March in 2025. We're a quarter of the way through the 21st century, folks, and a quarter of the way through the year. So, okay, here's what it was. Sam Altman of OpenAI released this thing on the most recent model, and they now have an absolute bowl of spaghetti of different model names. But I think this was maybe ChatGPT 4.5, I think. Anyway, doesn't matter. He released a piece of fiction. And what he said was, you know, this is the first piece of fiction which one of these models has produced that I found genuinely moving and touching, right? It's interesting. So I'm a writer. I write fiction. I have done for more than 30 years, right? And I did it professionally for a while. And it's an ongoing practice for me, one that's expressed both in sort of role-playing, but also more conventional sort of prose writing, right? Forms of storytelling. So I'm very attuned to this, to advances in this. And one of the reasons I played with these technologies as thoroughly as I have is to test their capacities, to see what they're capable of, right? And I've watched as it's gone model by model, and I could see the trend line quite early and discussed this with my class ahead of sort of the general boom, I think, my various classes at the university. But this new model produces this story. So I click into it and I read it. And I can see the limitations. I can see how it couldn't really carry this tone past this relatively short production, how it would be tiring, and right, I can see things. And there's a certain structural conceit to the prompt that I think lends itself to a kind of thing. But here's the thing. It was pretty good. Better than pretty good, actually. It was good enough that I was like, now, I think one of the things that's blindsided people in this field is that for a long time, the expectation around AI was that it was going to eat us from the blue collar up, right? It was going to gobble up the toes of the working class and people that drove taxi cabs. It turns out it's really hard not to make a car, I don't know, like drive into two grandmothers and explode into a fireball, apparently, or whatever they do. Not naming any names there. But you know, that's where we thought this was going to happen. Transportation. Even 10 years ago, there was a paper published that was like, we're going to see 25% unemployment, and it's going to be, you know, in that area. And around that time, I saw a paper, which was an interesting sort of military, pre-LLM military experiment where they were testing therapy, bot therapy, basically, with PTSD cases of veterans. And the veterans then reported something that hit me like a lightning bolt, right? And it was they preferred talking to the bot then. That's pre-LLM. They preferred talking to the bot because the bot never judged. No friction, right? And sort of a sense of secrecy or whatever. Now, professionally speaking, if you'd asked me 15 years ago, I would have said, psychotherapy is going to be one of the last blocks to go. And writing, likewise, I was like, it's going to be a long time before it can master this. This is very complicated. Well, it's actually turned out that in some ways, no, that stuff is easier, right? So here was the thing that really hit me about it, which was this. As far as therapy is concerned, I came up with my response years ago, which is like, oh yeah, when the AI really creeps up, I'm going to specialize in AI-related anxieties, and therefore I will be the last therapist on the planet who's a human therapist because the people that I work with, right? That's been the joke I've been making for a decade. But the writing, that caught me off guard. And it caught me off guard because I have a lot of rational optimist defenses, which keep me from spiraling around the fear of these technologies. But what I did not expect was that I had no defenses against the grief. I had nothing in place. And maybe I'm alone there. It's possible that artists who have been bitching about this justifiably for some time, right? Visual artists and so on and so forth that are like, Midjourney ate my work and I got nothing for it. And that is undoubtedly unethical. Maybe they've already gone through this grief piece. But for me, finally seeing something that's like, oh shit, this isn't maybe as good as me, and not that I'm the best writer or something, right? But I've put a lot of time in, a lot of effort, right? To build this little machine in my head that does this thing with language. And suddenly realizing, well, if not now, when? A year? 2? And then I will suddenly be in a position of being, aside from whatever professional considerations, right? Because I don't write in that way professionally anymore. I no longer try to earn my supper with stories in that way. But still, it's like I've invested a lot of myself and identity in this, and that really came to a fore. So you see how I think there's an interrelated set of questions here about what, coming to a sense of what our value or purpose is going to be, right? What is it that we're going to be about, right? And also at the same time, what therefore will we be able to, not just in terms of feeling as though we are making a meaningful contribution, but also in terms of this question of what it is that we offer each other, right? Because if the machine doesn't judge and it, gives us what we want and it gives us the illusion and it instantaneously delivers and it's algorithmic, and why the hell would I ever talk to my neighbor? So there's the problem, right? There's a very basic proposition here, because without that, right, if we can just have the safety space that gives us what we want, if we can just suckle at the high-speed teat, then we have no impetus to engage in a way that has the risk, right, and the vulnerability necessary to create trust. Because the creation of trust at the end of the day is about handing the other person a knife and them not stabbing you with it. That's how we develop trust. Think about it. You get to know somebody, you disclose something. It's personal. You do it tentatively, provisionally, right? And if they don't screw you with it, your trust goes up, right? If you can take your vulnerability, offer it to them, that them not screwing you is how you develop trust. It's that simple, right? It's the follow through piece. But if we're not clear about what it is that we can offer to each other, then even entering into that arena is a question. And that, I think, is a really interesting, novel, and potentially, obviously, deeply, deeply concerning to me in some ways, right? So
Yeah.
now, if, I do have something of a prescription there, I guess, but it's still very much up in the air, if that's not obvious.
Yeah, I hear you. Yeah, I feel drawn to quite a few lines of response in relation to
Sorry,
this.
I'm really carpet bombing you tonight.
No,
I apologize.
I do get the sense that we won't be able to relate with the as much of the whole of this as we might like in the sort of time we have remaining. But I'd definitely like to talk to you again soon. Like, like next month, couple months, that'd be awesome to return. And there's obviously, we spoke about a couple questions here.
Yeah, sounds good. I've just crawled my way out of my Groundhog Day alembic and poked my head around. Yes, I'm. And honestly, I should have you on my side too.
Hey, I would absolutely love to speak to you in whatever context. So, yeah, I think when I mentioned transcendence and that opening and reception to and kind of the words like a voluntary submersion come to mind here, which is obviously there's a bit of a paradox in that. But we began this conversation by sort of seeking out the notion of influence where that's not just reducible to pure causation. And I think somewhere in there is the where my compass is pointing towards as a kind of resolution is strong, but a kind of an ongoing resolution in a sense. And I'll go at it this way. The reality, and I, certainly you mentioned trend line, but I think it seems to be clearly the case that a certain percentage of the population, and perhaps we could all feel a desire for this at some level, but how much of a desire do I want to call that versus a kind of like a partial desire clothed with a whole bunch of other stuff. When it comes to just wanting a partner who's an AI partner just to support, right? Just when I hear that, because of course I can certainly rate, am I sick? Am I struggling? There are some times in which, and it certainly goes both ways, just being heard for the reality of the struggle itself, to actually bring that into presence and have that be accepted in a context of relationality, some context of belonging that is not immediately put into question by virtue of the effort to express my truth. It's so important. And yet, a lot of this becomes for me just what depth and richness is going into our notion of belonging. It's surely not the belonging that exists solely in the space that I can hold and grasp and put over onto others. It all has to fit into the way my house has to run, as if the whole earth belonged to me, all the subterranean parts too, not to mention the whole history of the past and the whole potentiality of the future. All of that, I mean, it becomes immediately laughable and obliterated by the reality of the world beyond one's ego. And so if I only seek out relationships that remain just supportive in the classic yes man to the dictator sense, then I will begin to decay, parasitize, and destroy the very context that enriched me with belonging at all, and the world I was born into.
Pitfalls of power.
Absolutely, it's the it's the profound limitation of power. And so the question then becomes, if that is the directionality of that particular kind of care in quotation marks, that performance of a function that the AI is doing, right? Well, was it ever real care in the first place? And just what is that promise and potential of that care and the risk associated with realizing that? There's and so the value of friction, bringing us closer to the necessity of an encounter with difference, the necessity of difference as such in the possibility for reality, it seems, relationship, all of that becomes relevant. And so my sense in terms of the inner compass of orientation toward, supporting a context that can remind through its own Vivekian word is coming to me here, its own eidos, can remind through its own essence and the realization of its telos as a continual process that joy and wonder and mystery and challenge and all of that is the richness of life through the very process that it's inculcating as part of its orientation toward relationship. That seems to be something deeply valuable that the human being can bring, which is to say they bring their mess and they bring that which is always in that mediated relation between perfection and imperfection and cannot be reduced to either of those. And so there's that. And on the writing side, that I receive also, and I understand why that sort of took you off guard. And as someone who's not written any fiction, but certainly appreciated a lot of fiction, and I find myself in awe of the great fiction writers' capacity to create these worlds, but also more than that, the artfulness that I seem to seek out is the great fictions are as much a contribution to the, from my perspective, the philosophical, theological canon as there can be, to the degree that the author is really grappling with has created a context in which to even ask of their divine connection to, let's say, a value or a virtue, let's say a character or even a god comes to represent this particular emotion above others and might be blinded to the others, but has in other respects the power of a god in order to enact into the world the image of their particular emotion that they value, honor or ruin or something like this, to quote Brandon Sanderson as some of his god type characters in his fantasies. What I do encounter though is I feel drawn to I feel I'm in a relationship to the author, struggling to actually, advance isn't quite the right word, but to almost like be witness, to offer their own channeling, their own conduiting of the relationship that plays out in story between these deep, profound perennials in their own way to attempt to evolve that. And I don't, and of course I'm moved by fiction, and I'll go into the process of a book, and that becomes one of the things I really look forward to during the day. But the book is put down, and then I always find myself re-encounter a richness that, no matter how profound the author's managed, is always beyond the book. It might be in the dishes I have to do or the argument, but there's all of a sudden the vitality and the life and all of that. And so there's something about the relationship I have with the author, it feels to me, as a distinctly human, as an actual relationship I could potentially be involved in, that's also playing out in my relationship to the text. In a similar way that when I watch sport, I don't think we will be interested to see AI simulate football games, for instance. We want to see something we can connect to and resonate with. Like, what is involved in resonation? Just what kind of relational process supports our knowing and our unknowing, but potentiality to know more, that's somehow involved in what we're then projecting onto and allowing ourselves to be drawn into the drama of as it plays out. And I wonder if, although it might be not as clear, certainly as I've put it, I wonder if art and in this case, fiction writing could potentially be seen along some analogous line to what I'm seeing in the context of sport here, based on our own projection of genuine relationality to the author. I don't know.
Right. No. I think that's a really interesting and sort of valid lens, and I think it opens up sort of a demographic question in a way. So one of the conceits, so let's broadly speaking here, just distinguish, and I don't want to single out books or writing per se. That's one of where my primary experiences are, but it's not limited to that, right? It's the whole of sort of artistic or creative production, right? And increasingly including things like, right, rhetorical delivery, right? The voices are getting better, and we are not prepared. We're not prepared for that, right? Like I think at a biological level. Now, this raises this question of what our commitment to authenticity in some sense is. And authenticity is something of a philosophical bugbear. It's a mess of spaghetti. And so we're not going to unpack that idea too far, right? But when you look at sort of the classic essay, what is it, like Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, right? And it talks about how, making a million, Andy Warhol making a million Marilyn Monroe images changes our relationship to the image, right? And our sense of authenticity. Art is illusion. Art is the lie that tells the truth, right? But it is, at least in its traditional form, at some level, actually relational. It's from one person to another person, right? Yes, you might come back into the field of your life, right? But the point is that you are in some way having, the author doesn't, the keyboard isn't the instrument. The reader is the instrument, and the author plays the reader, right? Plays emotions, plays concepts. That's what writing does. That's what art does. It provokes that effect in you, right? It's sort of fundamentally propagandistic. It's when it's done right anyway, it's like virtuous bullshit. Right? It's the lie that tells the truth. It's illusion. So illusion isn't new. And the idea that, that we all have some Plato's cave idea that we're all looking to like struggle out and burst into the Gnostic sunshine is like horseshit. That's not true. People often prefer illusion, right? They very often prefer illusion. So does that mean that everybody at all times prefers illusion, or to what extent people prefer illusion? That's a different question. You can assume that probably a range of responses will occur. So on one hand, you want to see the Olympics and you want some amount of anti-doping, right? Because you want to know what a human being can do if you don't juice them. Now, personally, I wish that they ran a parallel Olympics where they threw, the absolute limits of genetics, cybernetics, and let's see what the body can do when
it
we
would
really
be interesting.
overclock it.
It would be interesting. I give it to you.
Right. Okay. So there's like that enhancement access, humans au naturel. And that's a line we're always playing with. Are swimsuits too buoyant? Do shoes give too much advantage? Do whatever? We're always playing with this. Okay. And which drugs we can sneak past the blood tests versus whatever, so there's an incentive to make the inauthentic look real. But then there's also things that are what you might call, I don't know, para-athletic, or that's not quite right, para-sports maybe, like professional wrestling. Professional wrestling is a highly athletic activity, and one that has a perceived adversarial structure, but is not an authentically adversarial situation, and is not, we would generally say, an accurate representation of the direct contest of athleticism. There's a storyline. There are heels and right faces, and there's a whole thing, right? This is the, what the hell do they call that? It's going to drive me crazy. Thank you, kayfabe. Right? So that is like a para-sport thing that people also are interested in. And then, of course, there's like, do people want to see baseball players hit the maximum number of home runs? And do they give a shit if they're taking steroids to do it? Like, there's a whole set of things. So yes, sport still limits. Now, there's nothing that's competing with us directly in sport, which is to say that a Jeep has been able to outrun a human for some time, but we're only just starting to see a robot that runs like a human. I keep seeing these humanoid robots that they're training in China, and they're teaching them martial arts. And like so many of these things, I think to myself, it's like these people have never seen a science fiction movie. Like they've never seen. That's
It
what we
is
want to do.
wild.
Teach them kung fu. That's a great idea.
I almost like almost every conversation at the moment. I'm like, but are you including the fact we're literally building Terminators in your conversation?
Right. Yeah. Well, it's a hell of a question, right? Because we are, and we're not going to stop. But are we, to take the metaphor of the Terminator, because I think it's actually a great one. Okay. There's the first Terminator film, terrific film, right? And then there's the sequel, T2. And the most interesting thing in T2, in my opinion, is the bit where Sarah Connors is watching Arnold interact with John Connor. And she says something like, it was the perfect father. It would never yell at him, would never hit him, it would never come home drunk. It would never do these things, right? It's the perfect father. Well, that, I suspect, is, if you want to talk about sort of prophecy and the sense of something swelling in the zeitgeist, and that film is an interesting landmark for illusion in lots of ways, right? Really forwarded special effects. It's the last of the great 80s movies, even though it came out in the 90s. That is the question. So where are people as a whole going to land on the question of how much illusion do I want? Where do I want my illusion? Where do I want to have input into my illusion? A huge amount of my entertainment, to be honest, is collaboratively produced by real humans in real time, which is to say that my major hobby is role-playing, tabletop role-playing games. And the shared imagined space is an under-recognized art form and a sorely under-recognized technology that, we've known since the concept of VR came up, is eventually going to be a major form, right? But it's sort of embryonic in its dice and minis form, right? But the point is, you're engaged in collaborative storytelling. I do this. This is probably my actual life's vocation, if I'm perfectly honest. So, that space, right, is already a space where, people are engaged in the active production of culture. But look at the huge popularity of the viewing of that. Now that turns it back into a broadcast thing. And I used to always sort of say, it's like, if anybody said, can I watch? I'd always say, no, but you can play. And that's, yes, it's bringing lots of people into play, but there are a lot of people watching. To what extent is it the case, right, that we are going to want to participate and have other humans participating versus just getting what we want? And, sometimes I run estimates. A game that I like to play is, how long is it until I can say, computer, make me a new episode of Star Trek, guest starring so-and-so, make it 44 minutes in length, and have it run through the following themes, but surprise me. And the answer, I think, is it's a lot closer than we think. So, this is the thing, right? Participation and participation with other people is already, for many people, something of an acquired taste. Mm-hmm. There are virtues to it, but the idea that everybody is going to rebel and want to leave the Platonic cave seems not to line up very well with what we actually see, right? And what does that mean, right? So, I think that there are interesting ways forward. And when it comes to, if I was going to, I don't know, do you want me to give like a broad axis of synthesis here and see if I can tie it?
Yeah, go on then. Why don't we, I'll ask you to sort of share some of your thoughts in closing and whatever synthesis you'd like. And then I'll do the same and just ask some questions to the future conversation.
Sure. Okay. So to loop this entirely back around to the acausal and the synchronistic and meaning making and sense making, I hate that term, and a bunch of this other jazz, right? We've covered a lot of ground, but here's a basic question. One of the questions we came in with, and I've spent a lot of theoretical time and focus lately thinking about acausality, the science of it, the philosophy of it, the interpretation of those results, because no data is independent of interpretation, and that's called philosophy. So, working through this stuff, because acausality is absolutely, it's part of reality, period, full stop. It's not a question whether or not there are acausal events happening. It's only a question how we interpret them, and that's independent of our current models within, say, quantum mechanics or something, right? It's acausality is a thing. Step one. Step two, if acausality is a thing in one domain, then that is the exception that you need that breaks an absolute prohibition against that concept. So science, for a long time, had a fairly absolute prohibition. It was a strictly causal exercise, right? You know, Kant's idea and Newton's idea of science was back tracing of causes, right? D to C to B to A, back to some kind of cause. This is why famously Kant said a science of life is impossible, because it goes in a circle. The tree grows the leaf and the leaf grows the tree, right? And so having a notion of emergence in dynamical systems, right? One of those sort of things that we consider in cognitive science is central to this idea. This is where the science of life in right, Darwin becomes this dynamical system that produces complexification, yada, yada. Okay, but that's all still causal. The fact is that we've had a taboo against the acausal, except now there's no question. Acausality is a thing. If there was a question about whether or not acausality can happen or can't, that's solved. It can and it does. The next question is, right, we don't want to blanket that over other phenomena. But if there are other phenomena which have resisted interpretation and which might rely on an acausal interpretation, as indeed Jung and Pauli's idea of synchronicity and acausal connecting principle indicates, then we need to take seriously this idea because it is a possibility, right? Frankly, you know, I work in this area, philosophy of mind, and I don't have enough hubris to believe that we have solved the hard problem or like even something remotely close to it. I think it's a lot more mysterious than we like, even if we've got some kind of neat ideas, right? So, okay. So let's just take that for a second. And then let's take for a second that the experience of synchronicity, even if we can't speak to it being a metaphysical axis that links mind and world together, it is an apparent metaphysical axis that links mind and world together, right? And that's the effect it has. It has this Durkheim, this breakthrough effect, right? You know, when you experience one, it spears you, and you're often left with what? Trust, provided it doesn't descend into paranoia, right? If you're having a bad schizophrenic run, or you've taken too much speed or too much acid, and meaning starts to pour in on you, right? Which is to say you haven't adequately constructed your magic circle. You haven't done the banishings. You haven't learned the basic discipline of navigating some of these spaces. You can get that stuff blasting at you and it feels shitty, and then you're paranoid. And you think that either the CIA has a chip in your head or that God hates you and you're stuck in a Gnostic hell dimension. But let's assume for a second that it's generally positive, because that's typically the experience that people have. They have an experience that's almost like something superordinate in some way to normal experience and normal causal connection, gives them the big wink, right? That's certainly my experience. And never with enough specificity that you can nail it down, right? Which is a tantalizing relationship to parapsychological phenomena. That's a conversation for another day. And it might just mean that both of them are running off the same bed of cognitive biases and reinforcements or something. But the point is, the effect that it has on us is, generally speaking, one that encourages us, lends us courage. It gives us a sense that we matter, even if we don't quite understand our place. It reorients us in the universe. So I think that is an experience that is fundamental in some ways to a certain kind of depth exploration. Mm-hmm. And I think that moving into the magical worldview, which is something that certainly I've participated in since I was very young, to various degrees of sort of rigor, right, over time. But now I'm older and unabashed about my commitments to magic on top of my commitments to science. I don't have a problem with it, and I'm not really worried about being critiqued about it. I think I've got strong enough arguments to play. So, speaking as a magician, right, part of what I'm trying to do very much is try to examine what, in a utility-oriented kind of way, what sorts of things we can do to affect this space, to change the possibility space around it, to perhaps make these things more likely or more, right? To be able to have those breakthroughs at key moments. Moving into the magical space it's noteworthy that engaging in those practices does tend to send you on these sort of synchronistic blitzes. It's well known. You do Jungian stuff, yes, you're probably predisposed, right? Because you're already interested. But the point is, like, you start to look and it starts to gear up. You can apply a lot of skepticism and still get something that really throws you. However, there is something on the illusion side that we also need to be concerned with. This is one of my deepest concerns, frankly, with the algorithm, which is that the algorithm has a motivated, simulated synchronicity.
It's
pseudo-synchronistic. It's pseudo-synchronistic. And in the sense that the algorithm and its ability to control the information that it gives you on the basis of what some third party, right, it wants from that, whether monetary, attentional, or in terms of the modification of your perspectives, perceptions, affect, whatever the fuck, whatever it is that they're trying to do, right? And because they can do that. This is all now pretty much a given. We know, right? And conversion disorders spread through social media, right? What we used to call mass hysteria. Like, you can get effects that people are not banking on quite yet. And it's pseudo-synchronistic. So it's not just a question of how we relate to each other. So this is where I'm going to try to drive an axis through it and maybe allude a little bit to the wider sense in which I'm thinking about this. The question isn't just about how do we find a value in the subtle attunement to other people and the friction, right? You don't win, you don't learn anything when you win. How do we internalize that concept, right? With regards to our interactions with other human beings, how do we determine what is of value as opposed to what we want to abdicate, right? Because these technologies they amplify our powers, all right? I use them a lot. They amplify your creative powers, but they ask less and less of you.
Yeah.
Right? And they integrate themselves, right? The feedback loop is one that creates identification in the same way as you identify with a car, or in the same way as you identify with the internet. And then when it goes out, you feel like somebody blinded you and you're mad, right? Internet's still out, refresh, right? Yeah, when we integrate with a system, we come to rely on it. Call that addiction or compulsion, but we make it an identified extension of ourselves. We're doing that with these things. So partly it's a question of how we're going to answer these questions about our value, our nature, the value of other people, how that's going to answer against what their sort of ability to give us things is, how that interfaces with the illusory, and then more broadly, addressing hypertrophic stimuli, not just in the emotional or the intellectual or the physical domains, but indeed in the spiritual domain, where I think that people's sense of meaning, potentially speaking, can be hijacked by hypertrophic stimulus, a sort of super symbolic flow state, cough, cough, cue. So, right, these are the questions we need to ask. They're big, big questions. And my personal response is start learning a little magic, because that's the hacking. That's the learn how to hack your own system, learn how to hack art. That's what magic is to a great extent. And if there is a wider metaphysical application, great. But if it's just that it has an ability to break us out of illusions which are motivated, right? Illusions which are motivated by motivations that may or may not serve us. These are the sorts of decisions that people have to start getting the groundwork to answer for themselves, right?
Yeah, that was brilliant. That was brilliant. And I'm so glad that it felt like the last 2 hours of the conversation were part of the alchemical process, which then made that synthesis you offered possible. And that was an awesome synthesis, which I find super interesting. And of course, you're bringing in work and a lot of thinking you've already done. In these conversations, I love to, it always feels somehow more connected. I feel more in touch. I feel like I'm in the process of learning when the unfolding, as well as hopefully some generation as well, but when the expression comes through as an organic response to the shared journey and shared wrestle. And of course, there's value to interviews and what have you, but there's something about the playing rather than watching and the participation rather than just the observation that is necessary for that alchemy. And so anyway,
Absolutely.
I really enjoyed hearing that.
To produce something bigger than ourselves. So we got to spend time in the vessel. And, you know, as I mentioned, I think sometimes sealing yourself a little bit and then reemerging is useful. You know, drawing that magic circle, whatever that means, in different ways, and then reemerging is useful. You detect things that you might not otherwise. But also moving back and forth, right? Because, I don't know, the play of Maya is collaborative, and it looks like whatever. What's Hunter S. Thompson? When the going gets weird, the weird turn pro.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, well, I mean, there's something on the prospect of encouraging people to walk with you for a time into the underworld, which isn't particularly enticing as it pops up on one's algorithm if they're just going to relax or switch off or something. And so there's something about, you know, an invitation to participate when it appears in a medium that's largely designed for consumption is itself it's been a painful thing in many regards, because one of the things we've been speaking about at the network, and particularly with OG Rose, is that, you know, these conversations that Voicecraft is having, they're not really podcasts. If we were to define podcasts as most of the time being about the provision of the podcast as context for the guests to then broadcast their content, rather than this more involved participation, a real dialogue, basically, right? And so you could apply this to the whole context of dialogos and all of that. And so I think we're, in a way, still, and this links into a bunch of other conversations we've had and areas which we didn't go into today. Although now I remember we did talk about crypto together with a couple of people 3 or 4 years ago as well. I've always been, you know, seeking out how to understand the technological stacks and ways of actually designing technology that can support the kind of participation we might be speaking about here. So listeners can actually find some of these conversations. Just most recently, the Transcendent Design with Forrest Landry and Eric Harris Brown, but then particularly the conversation on grammatics. Eric is a founder of Holochain, and you know, a number of people in the network, and various episodes we've had that are exploring this type of thing. So there's a few of these different esoteric worlds that seem important to bring together, but don't necessarily share the same canon or the same, well, they might have a bunch of affective differences. But anyway, so there's all of that. What I will just say in closing is that on these questions of magic, of cultivating our capacity to relate with that, on distinguishing the kind of hacks that the algorithms can do onto us versus this mode of deepening relationship to the system and being. One is the, you know, billions-year-old evolutionary process, cosmic evolutionary process, depending on how you want to look at it, which has imbued us with capacity for feeling at all, right? And capacity for connectedness and wonder and relation with mystery and a profound connection between the internal and the external, all of that. Cultivating our relationship to that is a really deep thread of ongoing inquiry here that expresses itself in a few different angles in. And I feel like you've really, I feel like you just bring so much to that inquiry and that effort, and absolute honor to speak with you about this stuff. And I'm gonna bother you in just a few moments time to see if we can return in a couple months to follow on on some of these questions and maybe take magic and UFOs, UAPs, our relationship to illusion and all of that.
I totally forgot about the UFOs.
Primary. Well, we've set it up.
Yeah.
We've set it up.
Yeah, it's true. We've set it up, and boy, is there a lot stirring. Hard to know what. I don't know. I've been kind of tuned out of that, and I somebody who I knew who's married to a pilot asked me, like, he wants to know what you think about the whatever we call them,
UAPs.
They're not UFOs anymore. I don't know, whatever. They're still UFOs to me. UAPs, sure. And somebody else said to me, if there wasn't so much crazy shit happening, I feel like this would be like the absolute front page news. And totally. I was like, yeah, strange times. I will just say this before we go for the offline wrangling, which is it's always a pleasure to talk to you, Tim. And one of the pleasures in it is that you, I think, are a really genuine interlocutor. You're somebody obviously possessed of like a profoundly wide sort of openness, right? Active open-mindedness around things. And it seems to me that, we all, when you ask this question, right? It's the old Joseph Campbell, right? Figure out which myth you're living. What's the myth you're living? And, two sort of, I guess, Neo-Jungian things that we like to bear in mind here are that first, you may not just be living one, and you should figure out which myth you're living now, right? As you go through the stages of life, because there are different myths for this and different circumstances, right? But also that we are, in some ways, there's a great pain that comes from the rendering of potential into actuality and limiting ourselves in certain ways, becoming one thing, not another, right? And we can recapture a great breadth and so on. But at the end of the day, right, in a complex situation, we are called upon to different roles. A role that at one point I was more in the king saddle until I realized, right, relative to my projects, until I realized I didn't want to be a king. And I didn't want to be sitting at the round table exactly. I wanted to be a Merlin. And being a Merlin meant being an advisor to the king, certainly, being involved in policy, but not directly involved in the doings of the round table, right? Instead, you're, living backwards in time and doing your own arcane weird shit with fairies and crystal trees and dragons under the earth and whatever, but that you are called upon to make this relevant to, right, the circle, to the round table, to the king. And so we all have roles to play. And if I dare say, I think yours is perhaps expressed, at least in part, I would offer as pontifex, a term that people normally reserve for the Pope, but of course literally just means bridge builder.
Mm-hmm. Well, I like the bridge builder part more than the Pope part, to be totally honest with you.
Well, yeah, so you can leave the Pope aside, or you can call yourself the Pope of the internet. That's up to you. But, right, it's all about what you put on your business card. I think someplace I'm listed as chief alchemist in one company. Anyway, but my point is that you as Pontifex is a connector, right? Yeah, and connecting two people and connecting ideas and connecting together so many different domains. I don't want to say this is your entire dharma or something, but it does seem like it's an element of it, and it's something that you do well.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you. Well, let's bring it to a close.